Hi, you're with Julian on the Brown Notes on Review Sunday, and wow, what a period of music it is. This is going to be a review of the latest Deafheaven album, Lonely People with Power, but over the last 6 weeks or so, there's been so many amazing albums that have come out, and I've got a few more to review that aren't on today's list that are some of the best records of the year, and I only just anointed the Dark Side album as my favourite of the year so far, and it's going to change again already. So I am a big fan of Deafheaven, and I am ashamed forever to say that I didn't get their debut Roads to Judah in 2011. A band currently, George Clark, a very iconic looking Teutonic lead singer, and with Kerry McCoy, Daniel Tracy, Shiv Mehra and Chris Johnson are the current lineup. They really arrived on the scene with Sunbather in 2013, which caused an enormous amount of crossover. A lot of I went to those concerts, and the normal black metal concerts, everyone's wearing a black t-shirt. Everyone was wearing indie t-shirts. It was a very different crowd, and that's caused the primary, there's nothing more gatekept than metal in any music, and that caused a massive friction between the attention they were getting and ex-metal fans' favourite band. They're not black metal, they're not, they're a fabrication of it, but they crossed over, and Sunbather was an album of an era. It was arguably the most famous metal album of the last decade. Incredible blending of, I guess, shoegaze and other styles of music that were more indie analogous than just straight black metal. And I honestly think their discography is pretty impeccable all the way through. New Bermuda followed in 2015 and was another fantastic album, and so was Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, and they often branched out their styles. I think it was maybe Infinite Granite, or maybe it was Ordinary Corrupt Human Love, where at times they even dipped their toes into grandiose Guns N' Roses stylings, and a lot of their songs were huge, over 12 minutes long. And I think the general consensus is Infinite Granite kind of lost a little bit of momentum, but I'm kind of glad it did, because of this album, which feels in many ways like their most focused. People are saying it's a return to Sunbather and form. I would argue that if they made Sunbather today, it would be a very different album to the one they made 12 years ago before all the touring and other records. So it might be an accurate point to make. But I really think it's a distillation of where they've been up till now, focused much better, and pointing towards a new era of Deafheaven in a very exciting manner. It's a 6th album, and I just want to talk about the cover. I really think the Lonely People with Power name works on both a political level, looking at the current state of affairs in places like America, but also on a personal level. I don't know exactly the song, but apparently one of the songs on here, he talks about his dad showing him pictures of women to find out what kind of girl he likes. And then you've got this cover, which I can only read as pretty confronting: a prostitute and a young boy in a car, and what I assume is his dad's arm. So the whole sort of Lonely People with Power dynamic is reframed by that. I think it's an amazing combination of the potential of the title with a very sort of personalised take on a dad taking his son to a prostitute, is how I read it. I might be wrong about that. The album begins with a drone, which only lasts about a minute. It's like ominous drone, and Deafheaven is sort of perhaps more analogous to bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor or Sigur Rós in their widescreen building intensity on tracks. Doberman is showing that they still have that sort of big, expansive, widescreen melodic metal going on. It's like a lot of their music, it can move between the periods of it being sort of like a mid-tempo rocker before the squalls and screams start. And blast beats are often used by Deafheaven, particularly on this album, as almost like melodic backing. There's a lot of this album where they do blast beats with live drums on top of blast beats. It's almost like it's a permanent fixture in the background, making it sound probably their least compromising attempt at being a death metal album, yet it's still got a lot of elements of melody and songcraft that relate to the Deafheaven of the past. And it's got some like real full-blown Slayer riffage after the halfway point, and it's a very head-nodding album. I find myself nodding my head over and over to the tracks on this album, which is always a good sign. A lot of the tracks here, like they're short tracks on some of their albums, were 9 minutes. Most of the tracks here are much more sort of 5 to 6 minute zone. The third track, Magnolia, which is like they're a band where you can often not hear the lyrics, but it's often worth looking them up online so that you've got those as the backing to the song, and they're pretty full on. I sat and reflected on the only photo at your funeral, on the easel, in the shadow of the willow sacred heart, where we started wanting, weeding, southern autumn places of your life overgrown, warm winds blow, secrets we die with, trembling weakness is what haunts us now, inside the windows, what once made us proud. I owned everything thought to be suicidal mania. I was everything taught to me, drinking deeply the truth of my grief, but what else could I be? And I think that comes up about him being a reflection of the mentors, and also that almost adolescence analogous focus on the father teaching the son, which seems quite relevant at the moment. It's huge. Magnolia is another huge song. Like the opening sort of 4 songs are just incredible. Huge riffs, almost like 80s speed death metal. The production is on point. It's very claustrophobic, and yet very sort of clean and well done. Very wall of sound, bit Metallica-ish, I suppose, is an obvious thing. And it's like a 4-minute track, which is just shows how much more this album is distilling down those very long Deafheaven traits. And The Garden Route is another spectacular track. Unusually funky bass and drums going on here, showing another potential road for them to explore even more. Kind of reminding me a little bit of The Mission from the 80s, or Killing Joke or something like that. And it's got these indie guitar chimes that I kind of associate with either like the C86 Sarah Records crowd, or a band like Dive, who themselves are very shoegaze analogous, which is used a lot, and it's got a terrific chorus on it as well. Drive was another one on Heathen that came back to me to think about that whole sort of guitar tumble. Again, the lyrics are pretty full on. I wonder what is numbness, what is a coma, into the lights, closing his eyes in the lane, driving head into the mystery. And the vocals where he got softer reminded me almost of Tim Burgess of The Charlatans, which is an odd pick. And there's a lot of Cure-like colour to some of these tracks, which is something I'd accuse Dive of, but sort of like that Faith era of very sort of descending, morbid guitar passages. And it's, again, really catchy song. I found myself nodding away. The longest track is Amethyst, which has got the softest start and some whispered vocals. And again, those sort of Faith era Cure drifty passages felt the most like Godspeed You Black Emperor, who themselves are at a pinnacle at the moment. And it's got that whole drums on top of blast beats as well, and a very incandescent festival worthy finale. And we're only halfway through this 62-minute album, and it feels like there's an intermission. I did wonder whether this album was in 3 parts, but I feel like it may be there's an intermission at halfway, but then there's an intermission and epilogue, almost like a live set, I guess. So we get Joe Matthews from a band called Boy Harsher, who are apparently a very well known band from that area of America, I believe. Vocals here remind me of EMA almost, sort of this gothic medieval folk sort of vibe, and almost Swans, when the Swans are doing very still passages into their music, and of course it blows up again with these amazing noises which reminded me a little bit of like Tron era Daft Punk, or maybe Blade Runner 2049 era, that kind of very big noises coming through the soundstage. And if that is a intermission of sorts, we go straight back into the second half of the album, which is probably not half, Revelator, which has got some great heavy riffage. Possibly the most ordinary track on the album, and so far the only ordinary track on the album. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but there's nothing particularly special. I don't think it would be at the top of my list of the top 10 tracks on this album. Body Behaviour's got a real tonal shift. I was going to read the lyrics on the other one, Revelator. The truth of renaming our struggles, seething in secret, the mirror of the ugly cowards, taking the moment now, tying us to the ground, watching them hammer the nails. I'm bringing them bile, I'm clearing desires, coins on their eyes, I'm clipping the flowers of spiritless leaders. Oh, how they tremble in towers, lonely people with power devoured by God, which is obviously the de facto title track, and that's very much a more macro global view of the title than the cover is, or some of the other lyrics are. Body Behaviour has a almost TV on the radio circa Wolf Like Me sort of driving rock, indie rock. It's fabulous. And he uses the screamo vocal a bit more on the lower part of the song here, whereas normally he sort of drops it down to that more manageable vocal style, but here he doesn't do that, and it's again great drums and bass and melodic guitars and a lot of colour to the track as well. Paul Banks from Interpol turns up on the third and final interlude to just do a whispered talking piece for about 2 minutes. It's just a palate cleanser before a couple of fantastic tracks to end. Winona's got this real Godspeed Sigur Rós build, very slow build, anthemic, and it's an incredible track. I think it was one of the singles before they go off into the marvellous Orange Tree, which almost has some full-blown slow dive shoegaze elements. So this is an incredible album, and it has leapt to the top of my albums of the year already. I think it's a very beautifully sculpted and put together album length release. I get annoyed by how little credit this band gets. Every album has been great in one way or another, and most have been fantastic, and I feel like this is sort of resetting to maybe what Sunbather would have sounded like had they made it 12 years into their career. But it's definitely not Sunbather, and it's definitely not that shoegazy. It is uncompromising, but then it's a lot more focused, and I feel like it's in touching distance of the perfect Deafheaven album. So I'm going to give Lonely People with Power by Deafheaven 9.5 out of 10.